A prescription for the pharmaceutical industry. Drug firms consider new ways to stay healthy. But how do they balance the need for profit and new products? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, they provide hope for the treatment and cure of countless conditions, from cancer to the common cold. Pharmaceutical companies are also some of the most profitable in the world and constantly looking at new ways to stay competitive. The US drug maker Pfizer is trying to buy AstraZeneca for close to $100 billion. That will be the biggest ever takeover. Valeant is currently offering to buy Allergan, the maker of Botox, in a deal worth $48.7 billion. And Novartis has agreed to buy GlaxoSmithKline's cancer drugs for as much as $16 billion, while selling its vaccines division to Glaxo and its animal health unit to Eli Lilly.
Drug-fueled merger mania madness today. Yes, it's positive news for shareholders. Clearly what's going on big picture is these pharma companies are trying to rationalize their portfolios. They're trying to do less, better. Scale, critical mass and pipeline are absolutely important.
So lots to talk about there. To discuss all of this with me, let me introduce our panel. In London, we have Gustav Ando, the Director of Life Sciences for IHS and a specialist on mergers and acquisitions. In Geneva, we have Rohit Malpani, Director of Policy and Analysis for Doctors Without Borders Access Campaign. Good to have you both with us. Gustav Ando, I mean, we heard the clip there just a little bit earlier that this may be good for shareholders, but what is it going to mean for patients?
Well, I don't think it has an immediate impact on patients here. There's been some discussions around whether this kind of merger and acquisition strategy has an impact on price and access to medicines. But ultimately, I think it's a little bit of a tenuous link to make. I think the more immediate impact is on shareholders and on the companies themselves, of course, in terms of how they might restructure themselves as a combined company if they do take over AstraZeneca.
We often hear this argument as well, Gustav Ando, that you know, anytime there's a merger, not just in an industry like this, but any other industry, that it's often not a good thing for competition. If you're a believer in the free market and the idea that healthy competition promotes innovation and better products, if that's the case, can this really be a good thing?
Well, the pharmaceutical industry is an intensely competitive industry, probably one of the most competitive industries in the world. There's no one dominant player in the pharmaceutical industry. There's no one company that has a market share above 10%, for example. So it's a very, very diversified, fiercely competitive industry. And ultimately, pharmaceutical companies only have 10 to 15 years during which they have patent protection. After that, there's generic competition. And again, there are a number of players that are involved in any given therapeutic area, both on the generic side and on the branded side.
Rohit Malpani, I know your organization, Doctors Without Borders, relies a great deal on the cheaper generic drugs. Are you concerned about mergers like this and how they could affect your organization's access to those drugs?
Yes, we are concerned, more in the long term than the short term, although there are short-term impacts. In the long term, of course, we think that with less competition and with fewer players, we'll simply have less opportunities to develop the different drugs and vaccines in the therapeutic areas which matter most to our patients. Certainly with Pfizer and AstraZeneca, it's interesting that it's two companies that have basically written off research and development for neglected diseases. And certainly if they combine into one company, it probably will get a lot worse within that combined entity and probably more broadly across the field. Even in the immediate term, there are impacts. So for instance, Novartis selling its vaccines division to GSK means that there will be fewer players in the vaccines production business and research and development side. And that will mean that we will have fewer manufacturers at a time in which we are having problems with supply security for some of the most important vaccines in developed and developing countries.
But I believe, I mean, the flip side to that, though, Rohit Malpani, is that it allows Novartis to concentrate on what are called their core competencies. One of the things that's talked about is the manufacture of cancer drugs. Is that a good thing, that they'll be able to concentrate on that more now?
Well, certainly I understand from, again, the financial perspective and probably from a corporate strategy perspective that makes sense for Novartis and it makes sense for shareholders. But again, today, for instance, with the pneumococcal vaccine, we have a supply shortage globally where the two manufacturers, GSK and Pfizer, are unable to provide sufficient capacity essentially for all countries in need of the vaccine. What you would hope for is actually more manufacturers entering into the vaccine space to develop new vaccines as well as to ensure that we have enough supply. So again, in the short term, that could create concerns in terms of ensuring adequate capacity and competition. For Doctors Without Borders, of course, we're really focused on generic competition. So when you have two multinational companies combined, that doesn't necessarily have an immediate knock-on effect on generic competition, but it certainly does have an effect in terms of the R&D priorities and whether or not all therapeutic areas will be covered by these combined entities.
Gustav Ando, you are nodding in agreement to some of that. Is that a valid concern, and how this would affect the generic drug makers and those looking for the cheaper brands?
Well, I think to the extent that it doesn't really have much of an impact on the generic industry and availability of generic medicines, and ultimately I think that in the vaccine space it operates sort of separately from a lot of the other parts of the pharmaceutical industry, and I don't think it really will be impacted by actual mergers and acquisitions. I agree that there could be more competition, but a merger doesn't really stop that from emerging, and ultimately you have a number of smaller biotech companies that are emerging and growing pretty fast in the vaccine space, in the biotech space, and elsewhere as well, that ultimately is trying to reach for the stars, so to speak. So I don't think that a mergers and acquisition here necessarily is detrimental to competition.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about these mega mergers and whether they've worked in the past. We were talking just earlier about Pfizer's proposed takeover of AstraZeneca, but have past mega mergers really worked? Let's take a look at that now. GlaxoSmithKline is the result of two mergers between Glaxo and Wellcome in 1995, and with SmithKline Beecham back in 2000. Now, AstraZeneca formed when Zeneca, a spin-off from ICI, joined forces with Sweden's Astra in 1999. Pfizer has also grown through numerous acquisitions, including Wyeth for $68 billion in 2009, and all now are among the top pharmaceutical companies in the world. And now we're seeing what looks like fewer companies in what you've already said is a very competitive market. How is that going to affect things going forward then, Gustav Ando?
I think historically, I think it's very, very accurate to point out that these mergers haven't really worked out in the way that I think maybe they were positioned to the market and to the public, and the return for shareholders wasn't always great. R&D productivity didn't really increase, and ultimately Pfizer itself has had a number of difficulties over the last, let's say, 5 years because it wasn't really able to very strongly integrate Pharmacia and Wyeth in the kind of optimal way that investors wanted to see, really. So I think this merger and acquisition strategy that suddenly emerged over the Easter weekend a couple of weeks ago came out of the blue a little bit. There's been a quiet few years here in terms of M&A activity. Hasn't really been too many big deals. I think a lot of larger pharmaceutical players were both a bit scarred by the experiences of the 1990s and 2000 in terms of how those mergers turned out, but also a little bit cautious with the cash that they had in terms of the general economic environment. So I think that this latest activity is very interesting, and it shows perhaps that they're a little bit more confident with their money again, and also that they believe that they've learned from their past mistakes.
But I mean, much of what you talk about there, Gustav, is how it affects the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, and the shareholders who are invested in these companies. But I just want to go back to how this affects the average patient, the person who needs access to these drugs and needs them at a reasonable price. You know, when they go to their local chemist, or when they get these drugs from the hospital and so on. Is it really going to affect them? I mean, could it be detrimental to them in the long run as well? I
don't think so. I think it's too strong of a statement to make, and it's a bit of a tenuous one. Certainly I don't see any evidence from previous mergers or mega mergers that's been the case, that there's been a specific implication on price. When it comes to actual of pharmaceutical pricing, most pharmaceutical companies have a fairly sophisticated tiered pricing strategy whereby you have different prices that are weighted against the affordability and the ability to pay in, let's say, emerging markets as well. So, for example, you have very, very expensive hepatitis C treatment that's just been launched in the US, which has a 99% discount in Egypt. And so you, generally speaking, see that kind of diversification of pricing strategy to match those local conditions. And yes, there is still issues there, and many emerging markets and poorer countries are not able to afford some of these treatments. But ultimately, there is a broader issue there very often of lack of infrastructure in the country, as well as lack of government prioritization of healthcare funding, whereby they're spending a fraction of their GDP on healthcare compared to other markets in Europe and the United States, let's say.
I want to talk a little bit more about this, the question of affordability here. The new Sovaldi hepatitis C pill costs $1,000 a pill and $84,000 for a 12-week course. Yet industry experts are already suggesting it could end up being the biggest selling medicine of all time. Herceptin for breast cancer costs up to $47,000 a year per patient, while Crohn's disease drug Remicade costs $21,000 a year. So that's just a few examples we're showing you there. Now, Rohit Malpani, I'm no expert, but these figures must be all but prohibitive for most people. Is that a problem for organizations like yours?
I would like to correct some, I think, inaccuracies that Gustav was offering, because as an organization that treats thousands of patients around the developing world today, and that has to face the industry strategies in terms of affordability with tiered pricing, it actually doesn't work. We are facing an increased crisis in terms of the affordability of medicines and vaccines. So yes, there might be a 99% discount in Egypt, but it actually still is quite an expensive price in Egypt compared to the actual cost of manufacturing of Sovaldi, which from a study at the University of Liverpool shows that it's really only $50 to $150 to manufacture a cure or a 12-week course. And in other developing countries that are middle-income economies or low-income economies, Gilead may be offering a price that's actually thousands of dollars, which neither governments nor patients can afford. There is also a cost crisis in wealthy countries, and increasingly the United States, the European Union cannot afford to pay higher prices for these medicines. So this is a crisis that is being faced around the world, and the only answer from the pharmaceutical industry isn't to develop new innovation models and to actually think outside of perhaps even the patent system. It's simply to continue to double down on a failed strategy, which is to continue to grow larger and presumably to have more power to charge higher prices. And I really want to go back to one point, which is these mergers will have an impact on patients in developed and developing countries. Pfizer acquired Wyeth and subsequently divested or basically ended its anti-infective division, which means that they're no longer interested in producing basic antibiotics, despite the crisis in antibiotic resistance around the world, and even have cast off developing new tuberculosis drugs, even though nearly 2 million people a year die from tuberculosis. At the same time, AstraZeneca has shuttered its one neglected disease research and development facility in India, which actually was quite promising and was developing a range of interesting therapies for neglected diseases. That research institute will be turned into a resort. So in a sense, it's entirely appropriate that these two companies may end up merging because they both are equally uncommitted towards research and development on behalf of patients in developing countries.
All right, we'll come back to Gustav in a moment, but I want to put this to you, Rohit Malpani. What about the argument that part of the reason for the prohibitive cost of some of these drugs is that these companies have invested a lot of money themselves in the research and development? It's taken them years to develop and to get approval as well, and they just want to recoup some of that cost. What do you say to that?
Well, unfortunately, we've had to face years of highly inaccurate statements from the pharmaceutical industry, where you often hear the saying that it's $1 billion to invest in research and development. And increasingly, with more transparency and more statements even from the pharmaceutical industry, we're seeing that that's just not true. The study on $1 billion was actually done through a drug industry-funded study. Even the CEO of GSK, Andrew Whitty, has said that it's one of the greatest myths of the pharmaceutical industry, and the actual cost of research and development really is no more than $100 million for a new drug. It's expensive, but it's not nearly as expensive as most industry supporters indicate. We've also seen some new studies emerging from Harvard and Princeton which indicate that the actual cost of research and development is somewhere in that range. So yes, there are costs of research and development, but the reality is actually the public sector is paying for a lot of it. 50% of R&D costs today are paid for by the public sector and philanthropies. And what we're facing increasingly is patients in both wealthy countries and those patients that we represent are having to pay twice, both through their own tax dollars as well as through paying high prices.
Gustav Ando, these companies are not committed to providing affordable drugs to the developing world. What do you say to that?
It's not quite as simple as that, and I think you have to ask yourself the question, well, do you want these medicines or not? The pharmaceutical industry is founded upon a model of innovation and therapeutic breakthroughs, and the treatments that you've mentioned before in Crohn's disease, in rheumatoid arthritis, and in oncology, and various other illnesses. The standard of care there is barely recognizable from 10 years ago because of these extraordinary advances in care, and you don't get that for free, unfortunately. I disagree very strongly with the idea that
they don't have to be for free, but they have to be reasonably affordable, at least, don't you think?
And I think that they are, and for most countries, I think that's the case. I don't see in many of these emerging markets nearly enough commitment to actually funding these treatments, whether it's in HIV/AIDS, whether it's vaccines, etc. So I think it's really the government has to make a statement. Is it going to be spending, $1 billion on some new military equipment, or is it going to spend it on healthcare? Where, as a society, I think you have to make a decision. Where do you spend your money? And I think that in many cases they get that answer wrong.
Rohit Malpani, you want to respond to some of that?
It's just highly inaccurate. The reality is, for most governments in developing countries, they could quadruple or quintuple their spending on healthcare, and they still would face very high prices, would not be able to expand access to treatment. Yes, we agree that governments should invest more in healthcare, but those investments have to go towards very basic items, such as building new healthcare facilities, training primary healthcare workers, being able to diagnose disease. It's not to pay high prices for medicines. The industry will extract whatever it's able to from governments in terms of high prices. Everyone has a role to play, but unfortunately, industry often is on the wrong side of the argument. And really, the issue here isn't about tiered prices. It's the ability for countries to introduce generic competition for medicines. Industry is able to gain patents for their medicines, but developing countries and developed countries should have the right to override those patents, which is included under global trade rules, to bring in generics and to ensure affordable prices. And companies such as Pfizer and GSK and others are actually quite aggressive in preventing developing countries from achieving that balance between rewarding innovation and protecting public health. And that is why, as an organization, we are so focused on this issue today, because it affects the countries in which we work, and it affects our patients because we're unable to provide sustainable treatment.
What would you like to see more from the public sector then, Rohit Malpani? What do you want to see governments doing, aside from just further investment? What can they do as far as their relationship with the pharmaceutical companies?
Number one, they invest heavily in research and development, but they attach no conditions to it. So governments such as the United States spend over $30 billion a year on basic research and development, and often develop many of the new promising drugs that are then taken up by the pharmaceutical industry. But there's no requirements for access, and we see this all over the world today, where it's governments that are often paying for the basic research and development and then are just handing it over for free to the pharmaceutical industry and are turning around and paying high prices. Secondly, they need to have the political will to ensure that when high prices are being charged, that they use both their negotiating power as well as basic flexibilities under global trade rules to bring down the cost of medicines and to introduce generics. And thirdly, to the extent that we're increasingly seeing these mergers that really do raise concerns around competition and around the healthiness of our R&D pipeline, that they do carefully examine these mergers and ensure that we continue to have a healthy pipeline of new medicines, and that they actually have to ensure that they can encourage investment in areas that the pharmaceutical industry, quite frankly, doesn't think is relevant, including neglected diseases and basic things such as antibiotics.
Gustav Ando, just from a financial standpoint, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but isn't it in the interests of the pharmaceutical companies to make these drugs more affordable in developing countries? Because I mean, the way it seems right now is there are so many people who are being priced out of this. If the prices were lowered, more people would be able to get access to them, and that would be better for sales, surely.
Well, precisely, and that's why I think it's really unfortunate that Doctors Without Borders has such a, I think, counterproductive and willfully inaccurate perception of the issue here. These aren't financially stupid people. If it was possible to make these available at a cheaper price, they would, and ultimately they're having to withdraw products in certain countries simply because the governments are cutting costs and cutting prices of pharmaceuticals to such an extent that it's no longer at all profitable, not even close to profitable, for them to be operating in those countries. They don't make those decisions unless they really, really have to. Ultimately, they want the drug to be used by the patients. That's why they're in this business. So I find it very curious, this stance that somehow they're doing this just to benefit their own pockets. But now, obviously, it's not doing that, as you rightfully point out.
Rohit Malpani, I mean, what about the point there that if you, yeah, go ahead.
Sure, if I can. Oh, please, because you know what you have today is actually a tale of, I guess, two very different approaches. So, for instance, you have diseases like HIV and AIDS, and because there's an enormous amount of pressure on the pharmaceutical industry, you do see, and again, over a decade ago, the pharmaceutical industry tried to charge $10,000 per patient per year for these medicines in developing countries, and an enormous outrage erupted, and the pharmaceutical industry said, if we cut down our prices on these medicines, the roof's going to cave in and you won't have any new HIV medicines emerge. And of course, it was the opposite. We now have robust generic competition for many older HIV medicines, and many new AIDS medicines emerging today. We do have problems around the affordability of these newer medicines. Often they're 10 to 50 times more expensive than older HIV medicines because the pharmaceutical industry has patent protection for these drugs and is charging higher prices. More broadly, what we see today in developing countries is the pharmaceutical industry is trying to target the elite population and people who can pay higher prices or have insurance coverage. And so even though the vast majority of people in middle-income countries in particular, 75% of the world's poor live in middle-income countries, cannot pay for medicines at any price, that's not as relevant to the pharmaceutical industry as much as people who can pay higher prices. So naturally, they're going to try to charge higher prices for medicines in these markets because it's a financially smart decision to make. But from a public health perspective, it's not appropriate, and it's not consistent with the ability of governments to be able to provide treatment. And again, you can look at many disease areas. Developing countries cannot pay the prices charged by pharmaceutical companies that have monopolies on these medicines. What I'm saying is not inaccurate. It's really the reality, again, for our organization that is providing treatment in these countries, and for governments and for donors who often provide assistance to these countries in need.
Gustav Ando, don't these companies need to do more to get that balance between profits and public health?
It's the responsibility ultimately of the governments as well to look into this, and I disagree strongly with the fact that many of these poorer countries are not able to afford these treatments. Pharmaceutical expenditure ultimately is a tiny proportion of overall GDP spend, and even a small 0.5 or 1% increase towards the average in these markets would go a long way towards making these drugs available. Ultimately, pharmaceutical companies are not actually selling to patients. They're not. I mean, they are. Ultimately, they end up with patients, but the actual people that they sell it to is usually the government or some insurance company or payer. So ultimately, the negotiation happens with the government, not with the patient. So it's not the patient that's not affording this; it's the government, and the government has to make a very significant decision here about where it spends its money. And in emerging markets, demonstrably, it's true that they spend far less on healthcare, usually half or less than developed markets in terms of their proportion of healthcare spend over GDP. So even just a small 1% increase would go a very long way to providing access to much needed treatments in a lot of these countries. So yes, the pharmaceutical companies have a role to play there. They do play that role, and increasingly they try to diversify themselves and look at the overall healthcare infrastructure there as well. But there's only so much they can do. They can't be a master of all.
All right, one final word then, just in the minute that we've got left, to Rohit Malpani.
We agree that if governments expanded healthcare expenditure by 1% or 2% or even more, they would be able to expand access to treatment, but they would only be able to do that if they're able to purchase low-cost generic medicines. It's generic competition that allows for sustainable prices for old and new medicines, and it's through generic competition that governments are going to be able to expand access to healthcare. Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry, when they're unable to provide affordable prices, are not willing to allow governments to take measures to ensure generic competition competition and affordability. And that really is the crux of the problem today. And a lot of the companies, for instance, such as Pfizer, are really on the wrong side of this debate and are preventing developing countries from expanding access to healthcare.
Thanks very much for joining us, Gustav Ando and Rohit Malpani. And do please add your voice to this discussion online at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And we're also on Twitter. You can send your comments to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. The latest news is up next. Bye for now.